Hello and welcome to the latest and greatest episode of the Richard Watkins Podcast. I'm so excited that you are with us today because we have an amazing show. One of those special shows where it's just you and me. We like to break up our shows to include one-on-ones, but also those interviews that you have come to love and appreciate so much. But like we do every single time before the episode starts, we have to give a shout out to the folks that make this podcast possible. Huge shout out to the Science Policy Action Network, or SPAN Inc., the leader in consulting and engagement on a wide variety of issues. Hey, listen, I know that the world is changing. Every time I look up, there is a new innovation, and I'm trying to figure out how it's going to impact my life. Now, if I am making decisions, regardless of level, or I'm running a company, I need to know what is lying around the corner so I can make the best decisions. The Science Policy Action Network is your go to support for whether you want policy to support science or science to support policy. SPAN is your partner. Visit SPAN at span-inc.org. That is span-inc.org. Now that that's out of the way, let's get right back into it. The Richard Watkins Podcast. Hey, listen, I just want to figure out what are the top topics that we're going to cover today? Listen, we talk about a lot of different things, from the quality of air. We also talk about artificial intelligence. And of course, we also talked about quantum computing. But what are we going to talk about today? All right, listen, we've got a few things in store for you. We're going to touch on how we had a pig embryo that has a human heart. That's the first one. The second one is the brain implant that helped an individual who was suffering from ALS regain the ability to communicate. That is an awesome one. But we're going to first talk about psychology. All right. So if you didn't know, my background is in psychology. I was classically trained in psychology, Fayetteville State University, right behind me. And I absolutely loved psychology because it allowed me to understand why people do what they do, think what they think, behave the way that they behave. It's awesome to really, really think about it. I think about it all the time, right? Well, not too long ago, we had the North Carolina Teacher of the Year on, and I remember she was on just talking about, how important education was. It allowed individuals the opportunity to really think critically about the world around them, and that the ability to critically think was absolutely essential. And I remember she really encouraged individuals to really do what they know is right. Don't follow crowds, don't follow trends, do what you think is right. But in that conversation, I remember saying, I think that's, great to really encourage folks to do that. And I definitely think that it is important to encourage folks to do that. But I think it's also really, really important to appreciate just how hard that is to do, right? I know a lot of folks are out there like, think for yourself, think critically. But I think one of the questions that I ask is, why doesn't it seem that people think critically? Why does it seem that people go with the flow, or despite what they may think, feel, or believe, they go along with the general consensus? Well, there's a reason to that. Um, we are psychologically predisposed to go along with what the majority feels. That's not always the best thing, but it is what we do as humans, right? And so if you're always asking questions like, why are they doing this? Or why is this person just going around? And if you're like me, you've heard that old timey saying, like, hey, if everybody jumped from a bridge, will you do the same thing? I mean, the answer is probably yes. And our understanding of that comes from the Ash conformity experiment. And I touched on this a little bit when we had an opportunity to talk to Kim Jones. And I just want to briefly touch on it again, just to really kind of highlight how amazing this study was. So it was called the Ash conformity experiment, and it was conducted by Dr. Solomon Ash in the 1950s. Now, in the study, our participants were placed in groups with several actors, right? Now, the participant isn't an actor, they are participants. Now, the actors were given scripts and they were told how they should act and how they should behave and what they should do. Now, get this, this is just really, really cool, right? So, participants were placed in a group with several actors who were in the experiment. Now, here it goes. Now, the group was shown a card with a line on it, followed by another card with three lines labeled A, E, and C. Now, the task was to identify which line on the second card matched the length of the line on the first card. All right, so you got it? It's all about, all right, which is the line that you see, like matching them up, right? Now, this is the twist. The actors were instructed to unanimously give the wrong answer on certain trials. They were told to give the wrong answer unanimously. So just imagine you're a participant, right? And you're sitting on a panel in which you're supposed to describe what lines. Now, everyone else on the panel agrees on a certain thing, right? But in this case, they are told to deliberately agree on the wrong answer, specifically the same wrong answer. Now, if you check out any of my other episodes, you'll find this really, really interesting, right? The experiment, right? The experiment found that many of the participants conformed, right? Went along with, conformed to the group's incorrect answer, even when it was obviously wrong. All right, I'm going to say this again, right? So the actors, they were told deliberately to give the same wrong answer, right? That instruction wasn't given to the participant. The participant is supposed to be doing their best to give the right answer, right? So in these cases where the participants unanimously give the wrong answer, the participant, not the actors, the participant goes along with whatever the majority says, even though they knew it was wrong. Now, this demonstrates the powerful influence of social pressure, right? You are a combination of your own internal motivations, but you are also a product of your collective social environment, right? So it is hard to think differently than the group that you are within. And the Ash conformity experiment showed a little bit of that. So one of the things, if you're out there and you're trying to figure out why do this group of people think this way, and why when an individual is presented with information that contradicts their belief, why do they still maintain those beliefs despite the fact that they have now information to the contrary? And it's because there is huge pressure that is placed onto someone. And that pressure, in this case, is social in its nature. And we can never, ever discredit or underestimate the power of that social pressure because individuals will do, by and large, what their social system ends up doing. And again, it is despite how they may personally feel or think about an issue. And again, that was the Ash conformity experiment. And we talked about that. And since then, I have been thinking about that a lot. It explains a lot of what we see in our society, in our communities. Um, and so that really got me thinking. I remember I was telling somebody about that, and they were like, "No, I wouldn't just go along with something just because everyone else was." And I told them about the Ash experiment, and they're like, "Oh, okay. I guess we are way more vulnerable." And I think that probably comes, and again, I'm kind of spitballing here, so check this out yourself, right? You can find it anywhere. It's 1950s. It's a huge experiment. Any psychology majors out there know exactly what I'm talking about. But I think there's a there's a purpose behind it, right? Hunter gatherers trying to figure out what food they should and shouldn't eat, right? Because if you make the mistake, right, and you go off on your own and you eat the wrong food, you could get food poisoning, you could die, and that's too risky. And so we evolved the tendency to go along with the group as a means of safety, survival, and security, right? We would eat what the rest of the group ate because the group had already decided that this was okay to eat. We behaved like the group because being pushed out of the group, it reduced oftentimes your ability to survive. So there was increased pressure placed on individuals from an evolutionary perspective to kind of go along with the flow, to go along with the group, right? It's a survival mechanism and it's very, very powerful. And so it's really important. So that really got me thinking, like, what are some other really interesting things that really kind of explains the way people act, feel, and think? And coming from the as conformity situation, I was like, okay, what's another really interesting observation? And again, this is the Richard Watkins podcast, and we're talking about psychology and why people do the things that they do right now. Again, first person was the Ash conformity experiment, and that researcher was Solomon Ash, and that was in the 1950s. Now we're going to move on to a very famous researcher, and there's movies made after, but Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram conducted a arguably equally famous, some people may say more famous experiment in which they didn't want to look at conformity. But Dr. Milgram wanted to really kind of understand, you know, how people, again, with regardless of how that person thinks about something, how does that person then just completely push their own personal views, beliefs, and thoughts to the side and then does something completely at times antithetical to their own personal beliefs. And so the conformity experiment was one, but another one is the obedience experiment done by Stanley Milgram. So Milgram study is known as the Milgram obediency no, sorry, obedience experiment. And this was done in 1960s, 1961. Now, what it went about doing, and I'm just reading here, it went about testing, right? It tested how far, how far, how far individuals would go in obeying an authority figure. So this is still a type of tremendous social pressure. One is a social pressure of like peers, but another is that social pressure of being obedient to an authority figure, right? Which is something that is also specific, right? Is also something that is part of being a human, despite what you may think about yourself. Part of being a human is this tendency to follow an authority. So far as what we've seen, and the people involved with the experiment, and I'll break it down real quick. So it was known as the Milgram Obedience Experiment, 1961, and it tested how far individuals would go in obeying an authority figure, even here's a cool part, even when it means harming another person. All right. So that's the huge thing, right? So how far would we go in obeying an authority figure, even when that obedience meant harming another person? All right, now let's go. Quick breakdown. Here's the setup. So, participants were told that they were part of a study on learning and memory. That's the setup. So, participants are coming in. Uh, they are under the belief that they are part of a study on learning and memory. Now, they were assigned the role of teacher, while an actor, let's see, it's another. So we've got the Ash, right? And now we got Milgram, and they're both utilizing actors, right? While an actor played the role of the learner. Okay, so we've got a teacher and a learner. The participant is the teacher. All right, the teacher was instructed, right? This is a famous experiment that has shaped the way we think about the way people behave and act. All right, huge, 1961, Stanley Milgram. Now, the teacher, right, who was a participant, was instructed to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to the learner for each incorrect answer. All right, so you got the participant coming in and they're like, okay, I'm involved with a study on memory. And they are told, instructed, now listen, shock this person when they get a wrong answer. Okay, so they're already coming in on that, right? Now, what do you think they did? Right? Right. So just the setup. The learner, right? The actor. Now they weren't actually shocked, right? But because it was an actor and the person was pretending to be shocked, the teacher believed. The teacher believed that they were actually shocking this person. Okay. So despite hearing, right, the learner scream in pain and agony and protest, or even if they just fall silent and they're not even responding, a majority of the participants, these are just regular people, a majority of the participants continued administering shocks. The majority, that's like over half, right? Over 50%, right? Of participants continuously administered shots. That's just amazing, right? Continuously administered shots by an authority figure in a lab coat simply because they were told to do something. I think a lot of people hearing this are like, oh, what's the big idea? But some people can hear that and they're like, wow, yeah, if you are deemed to be an authority figure, the likelihood that people will just do what you tell them to do because you told them to do it is extremely high, right? And so that's why it's just really, really just important to really understand. So in summary, right? So the Solomon Ash experiment, conformity, line, and judgment, right? Right. That pressure aspect, that's really what they're getting at. And the Milgram experience is obedience and authority, right? So that's the huge thing. It's just absolutely huge, absolutely huge. And what I'll leave you with last, so we got Ash, we got Milgram, and now we're going to get into Zimbardo. So Philip Zimbardo was a researcher, and he's famous for another experiment that is almost a decade after the Stanley Milgram experiment. It was known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. I know a lot of folks have heard of that. It is a landmark study in psychology. Now, here's a brief overview of it. And this Man, these experiments, right? It tells you because we've got this idea of who we think we are, who we want to be, which is oftentimes aspirational. But when confronted with who we truly are, oftentimes we try to keep it at arm's length and always trying to explain it away instead of taking what we learn and applying it to bettering ourselves. But that's up for you to decide what you want to do with this information. But I always think these experiments are just absolutely incredible. So, overview of the Stanford prison experiment, right? So, it was conducted in the basement of the Stanford psychology department, right? So it was on the presence of the campus. And so they really set up a prison in this basement, right? Like, so you could observe, but you could also have people participate. So you had 24 male college students randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards. So in this situation, you've got no actors, you got everybody participants in this, right? So that's a little bit different from the Ash experiment and the Milgram experiment. This one is just using participants. Now they get different roles, right? Either guard or prisoner. Okay. Okay. Now, the guards were given uniforms, sunglasses, and the authority. That's another really cool piece of authority here to enforce rules. The prisoners were arrested at their homes, given prison uniforms, and stripped of their identity, so their names, so they're just assigned some random thing, right? Now, what happened? The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, 2 weeks, right? But it was terminated after just 6 days due to extreme and it's disturbing behavior that was produced. Okay. Now, these are just regular students, right? Who were brought in and were assigned the role of guard or prisoner. Now they were just assigned these roles, right? They don't have to do like, okay, the guards became increasingly abusive, and the prisoners became passive, depressed, or emotionally unstable. Even Zimbardo, he's acting as a prison superintendent, became absorbed in the role, illustrating how situational forces and institutional power can rapidly distort individual behavior, right? So it's kind of like when given an opportunity to have power over another individual, this experiment showed that there is a tendency to really abuse that power, right? It doesn't always happen, but there is a tendency to abuse it. And this ended up being a hallmark. And there's so many other little nuances of the study that just make it absolutely remarkable. But this is a situation that we have where you have a abandonment, complete abandonment of what an individual is, I guess, would deem normal, right? Just if certain factors change, right? So in the Ash experiment, we just saw that an individual will go against what they believe to be right or wrong based off of the consensus of the group, right? That pressure that's being exerted, right? That's the Ash experiment. The Milgram experiment which it showed that an individual would abandon what they believe to be right or wrong, um, simply if they were told to do so by an authority figure, right? They will abandon, right? If an authority figure told them to do it, they will abandon what they personally believe as being right and wrong to obey the authority figure. And then the not Stanley Milgram, but the Philip Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment showed that if you change circumstances and you change the settings, right, as in the case of creating an artificial prison environment with guard roles and prisoner roles, people will also abandon what they believe to be right or wrong or their own identity of who they thought they were. Go figure. Go figure. I always really, really encourage people to really just understand who they think they are versus who they want to claim that they are. Because if we start really trying to figure that out, that's when we can make really, really huge progress. It's just it's just amazing to really look at these things and just really figuring out how people think, how people think. Yeah, that's huge. That is absolutely huge. Absolutely huge. Well, that's an appropriate segue to our next piece, right? So we just wrapped up psychology. We talked about Ash. We talked about Milgram. We talked about Zimbardo. But we've also got huge breakthroughs that are happening right now that are helping us understand exactly how we think or feel. Now, this is coming straight out of Science Magazine, and I want to really touch on that. Science Magazine published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. Now, check this out. This is really, really cool. Casey Harrell, right, a 47-year-old climate activist, lost his voice to hemiotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, lost the ability to speak. However, this is just absolutely amazing. However, they were able to regain the ability to speak. And it's just absolutely mind-boggling how it happened, right? So researchers at UC Davis implanted 4 micro electrode arrays, 256 electrodes in total, into a 45-year-old man's speech and motor cortex. So these are brain implants, okay? So a brain implant. Now, using artificial intelligence, the system decodes neural activity, right? It decodes neural activity, right? And basically your mind and your nervous system is commuting by the release of neurotransmitters across a cleft between a receptor, across a synaptic cleft, right? Between the axon terminal and dendrites between, two neurons, right? But it's able to interpret all of that and then convert it. And I guess much the same way that your mind does, right? Creating a natural sounding sentence with intonation, emphasis, and the ability to ask questions or even sing in simple melodies. Operating through the Brain Gate 2 trial, this tech delivers speech synthesis in real time, more like a live voice call than a delayed text conversation. Now, the system achieves about 60% word intelligibility from untrained listeners, which is vastly better than anything. And I want to go back to kind of the Science magazine that really lays this out. And I want to go to kind of some of the last thoughts, right? So the main question here is how well the approach will translate to other individuals with different types of speech impairments. So this is working in this situation, such as those caused when stroke damages different parts of the brain. The researcher adds that it's still unknown whether the device will continue to work as the person who is suffering from ALS progresses and their motor cortex ends up degenerating, right? So it's working now, but the question is, as the disease progresses, will the implant be able to keep up with this? I mean, these are huge questions still, right? Now, the response is a new clinical trial led by the co-author of this paper that describes it, and this again out of UC Davis, it may soon answer that. Now, the researcher plan to implant various devices, and we talked about this just a minute ago, 1,600 electrodes into people who have lost their speech to a stroke or neurodegenerative disease, right? Now, it will give participants extra electrodes, and it might make their brain generate speech even more intelligible than the person with ALS. But they want to really, really make sure, right? So, and the individual's name is Casey Harrell. Just want to just pause really quick, right, and just really kind of describe, where we are. Um, so we just described implants into the brain, and the goal was to have the ability for somebody who's lost the ability to speak and to communicate. That was achieved, right? I think one of the things that's very, very interesting is that we are and we have been making huge strides in regards to human machine interfaces. And this is one of those steps in that direction. You have an interface between the human, their thought, and obviously the communication of that thought through machine, which also utilize, artificial intelligence as well. Now, some reports are saying that the ability to communicate is indistinguishable from regular communication, right? Indistinguishable from regular communication. So what we have is a situation in which we can utilize innovation technologies to give people something that they have lost. But I think one of the really interesting questions is how can these implants, and this is not coming from this paper, but the question is how can technology not only allow people to recover something that they've lost, but for individuals who haven't lost anything, can these implants improve? Can we become more? Can we become better? That's a huge question, right? Can we increase our cognitive ability through the improvements of machine human interfaces, right? I think these implants and these technologies are going to continue to progress, and there's no telling how we will benefit from them. Keep in mind, these investigations are about restoration and how to restore, right? To regain often, right? But there in all of that is the opportunity and the very real possibility of going beyond normal human capabilities, going above and beyond normal human functioning. And I think that's there too. It's not written here at all. However, in my opinion, it's the logical next step. It first starts with trying to figure out how these technologies can be useful. And one of the first ways they can be useful are for individuals who have lost, for one reason or another, gain or regain. The next step is how do we get even better? And I think it's absolutely right there. I think it's absolutely right there. I'm Why can't an individual who possesses no ability to speak another language, why can't that individual who has these implants have an AI interface that immediately converts what they're saying into another language? That's not even a far-fetched technology. That technology already exists, this language conversion technology. This is what I'm talking about. These pieces already exist. And I think we're getting to the point where we're converging a lot of these things together. And so we could very well have a interface between a person and a technology that will allow them to speak every single language that exists. Like there's no reason why someone, when they speak, it couldn't automatically be converted into another language. And I'm not even talking about just like they don't even have to speak, they have to think. And that thought is immediately converted into another language. So it's out there, it's possible. You know, one of our goals here is to talk about what's possible, what's next, what's coming, not just about what people are talking about now, but this is absolutely huge. You could definitely have this. And like I said, a lot of these technologies already exist, but they exist in different spaces. And really what we're trying to talk about is bringing them all together. And I think breakthroughs like this and breakthroughs of many more, there's several other human interfaces where you're having brain implants um, that lead me to believe this to be true. And we're just talking about like language. There are so many other applications of this, right? If it can immediately convert into different languages, you know, why then could you not have an implant that allows you to have expertise in an area that you never received training in? And that's just another example. It's not technology that we have yet, but this technology leads one to imagine what lies just around the corner. All right, let's round it on up here, right? So we first started talking about experiments in the past with Milgram, Ash, Bardo. We then went to talk about brain implants that give somebody the ability to talk. Now we're going to talk about something that is just straight out of science fiction. We just recently had a research. Let me get this right. Let me get this all right. I just want to tell y'all exactly what's going on. Let's see. All right, we had something out of the Salk Institute. That's an amazing research institute here. Just want to make sure I get it right. Just forgive me. All right, so this breakthrough came out of the Salk Institute. So Dr. Juan Carlos Espicia Belmont at the Salk Institute, and forgive me if I said that name incorrectly, out of the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, his lab pioneered the creation of, get this, early stage human pig chimera. Chimera. You know what a chimera is? All right. Check out mythology. Basically, it's two animals mixed in with one. It's pretty amazing. Now, if you're ever interested in like the hottest things in regards to science and you're trying to figure out where it's at, like I love going to Nature or Science magazine. Now this one comes from Nature magazine and the title is Tiny Human Hearts Grown in Pig Embryos for the First Time. Yeah. So what researchers were able to do is have a developing pig develop and grow a heart that is not the heart of a pig, but the heart of a human. And so researchers have reported growing hearts containing human cells in pig embryos for the first time. Embryos survived for 21 days. In that time, their tiny hearts started beating. The findings were presented this week at the annual meeting for International Society for Stem Cell Research in Hong Kong. This was picked up by Nature magazine, and it represents a huge breakthrough in so many different ways. Every single year, people wait on organs to be donated. You have several complicating factors, such as how do you transport these organs? How do you keep them viable for certain level of time, the availability of these organs, different donor recipient matches that have a lot of problems. And then you just have a very long waiting list at times for the reception of these donated organs. So what is the way around that? How do you figure it out? Well, some people believe that if we are able to grow human organs, then that will make those organs more available. Well, then the question then lies, how do you grow these organs? So a lot of people have been looking at the pig for a very long time for a wide variety of reasons, but mainly because there's a lot of similarity between the pig organ system and the human organ system. And it's because of those similarities that it makes the pig a appropriate or a suitable host for a lot of these questions regarding transplantations of donor organs. So being able to grow a human organ inside of a pig allows for the creation of organs at a scale that may ameliorate the strain that is placed on the donor, the organ donor system. So it represents a huge breakthrough that could be the answer to prayers for so many individuals who are waiting to receive organs. It just creates a whole new opportunity. But understanding how organs develop, how to create organs is a huge step that can have such widespread implications. Obviously, it's providing relief to the organ donor situation and circumstance that folks sometimes find themselves in, but it also creates a better understanding on organ development. And by understanding these systems, we can better detect developmental issues that impact several organs, such as the heart. We will be able to better treat, and we could develop the tools that would eliminate the need for organ transplants entirely. Now we're looking far, 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 far down the road, and there's no telling that that is the direction that these technologies will ultimately go into. But the sky is the limit, and the only limit actually truly is your imagination on how these things will impact and better our lives. And so, taken together, today we've discussed human psychology and what we already know about human psychology and how pressures of a social group can overpower internal motivations and internal senses of what's right and wrong. We also talked about how authority is obeyed despite what someone may already believe in. And we also talked about how situations can change the way people feel about themselves and who they think they are. And their feelings of right and wrong may more or less be associated with the situation that they are in rather than who they are. We also went on to talk about breakthroughs on human cognition, human brain, and machine interface. We talked about the huge breakthrough spearheaded by many groups, but this group specifically out of UC Davis, um, and their ability to uh, give back the ability to speak to a 47-year-old man who is dealing with ALS, which creates a huge breakthrough in being able to not only regain and restore certain functions, but it also paves the way to go well beyond what people are capable of today cognitively. And then we went on to talk about the huge breakthrough that was pioneered out of the Salk Institute with uh, the work of stem cells and having a a animal model, in this case the pig, grow a heart. And the implications, perhaps, of this are far reaching in addressing the need of donor organs, but also beyond that, increasing our understanding of organ development, genetic development, and so on and so forth. Basically, we are living at a time where, again, I stress the only limitation to what we are able to accomplish is our own imagination. No longer are we living in a time of things being impossible. We are living in a time where possibilities are endless and all around us. This has been another episode of the Richard Watkins Podcast. I'm happy, proud, and honored to have been with you all today as your host, Dr. Richard Watkins. This podcast was made possible by the Science Policy Action Network. Check them out at span-inc.org. Thank you all so very much for being with us today. And remember, the future is not something to wait for. It is something to build. You all take care, and I'll see you next time.